You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to episode number 69 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. Insert sophomoric joke here. Anyway, this week I'm happy to be sharing Chip's first step presentation from the Noon group. And by the way, Chip just let me know that last week's episode I had mislabeled episode 64 in case anyone was confused. I've gone in and fixed that, so it should be reading episode number 68 now. And as I had mentioned on last week's podcast, I needed to get the approval of the Noon groups to make sure that we could do this recording. We have done first step recordings in the past on episodes 26 with Rye's first step and on episode 44 with Brandon's first step. In preparation for both of those, we talked about doing the recording about a month before the actual first step presentation. This time, however, it was on short notice. And realizing that we had done these types of recordings before, I thought the group would be perfectly fine with it. And I did not properly check with the group to make sure that everything was okay. When I had made the announcement that Chip was going to be doing his first step, and Chip approached me to ask if we could record it for the podcast, that we would do what we can to make sure that everyone was safe, someone had pointed out that this was going against our traditions. And so it led to conversations around this topic. And so for the two readings that I picked out this week, one is on the first step and one is on the traditions. So before getting into the traditions, I wanted to read a little bit about the first step. After our noon meetings, we do have a time for asking questions during fellowship, and there have been a lot of questions about how we do first steps in our program. A lot of people will do written first steps, and occasionally we have formal first step presentations at meetings. And this is much, much different than other 12-step programs. So I wanted to turn to some of the pages of the Green Book, that's Sex Addicts Anonymous. And I've done similar readings from the Green Book on Rye's first step and Brandon's first step. And so I wanted to try to focus on something a little bit different. In Rye's first step, I believe that I read the bottom of page 23 and the top of page 24. And in Brandon's first step, I read something out of Voices of Recovery, which referenced some of the pages in the Green Book as well. So this time, I wanted to read a few sentences from page 23 and then jump over to a couple paragraphs on page 24. And again, this is step 1. We admitted we were powerless over addictive sexual behavior, that our lives had become unmanageable. Many of us had found it helpful to examine our sexual behavior in detail when working this step. Some of us write a history of our sex addiction from as far back as we can remember up to the present, trying to leave nothing out. And before moving on to the next few paragraphs, I did want to mention in last week's episode 68 with Joe and Charlie, they talked about in step 4 a misconception about writing our whole life story. And I had failed to mention during that episode that that sounds really similar to what we do as our first step in Sex Addicts Anonymous. In our program, this is part of our step 1. So moving on to page 24, in the middle of the page, in listing examples of powerlessness and unmanageability, we include specific details which helps us to recall the thoughts and feelings we had at the time, and makes the reality of our sexual addiction more and more evident to us. Although we work the step the best we can, more may be revealed later in our recovery. The important thing is to work the first step now to the best of our ability, in the knowledge that we can always work it again when we need to. We get help from someone in the program, usually our sponsor, to work the first step. We need support while facing our addiction. A sponsor can help us face those parts of our disease about which we are in denial. We may think, for example, that the risks we took were not that dangerous, or the consequences were not that severe. Our sponsor can help us see more honestly and clearly what our situation was really like. If we choose to do a written first step, we usually share what we have written with our sponsor. For many of us, this is the first time we've told the whole truth about our addiction to another person. So yeah, I did want to read those few paragraphs. One of the questions we got during our fellowship was, can I work the first step on my own? Do I really need the help of a sponsor? And I like what this reading has to say about working with someone else, that outside eyes, whether it's a sponsor or someone else in the program, can help kind of break through the denial. I know my sponsor pushed me hard on things that I was kind of vague about when I originally talked about, I've got an issue with pornography. He really got down to it and said, that's being super vague. Exactly what types of things are you looking at? And I made a list of all the different categories of things that I was looking at online, on videos, on magazines, all sorts of things. So having someone else to help kind of push back the level of the denial that I was facing when starting to write the first step was a huge help for me. So back to the recording of Chip's first step. After we had a confirmed date and I was making announcements about the podcast, I did say that we would be recording Chip's first step for the podcast. And it was then that it set off a couple things in motion that some people were not comfortable with that, and that I needed to take it to the group. In doing preparation for making this podcast, I have been studying the traditions quite thoroughly, but again, I am one person. So we had a conversation about what traditions might be violated by doing a recording during a meeting. And for the previous recordings that we have done, we kind of went through the traditions and made sure that everything was okay. When doing a recording, I'm using only the audio, so we're not using video. And so the anonymity is protected. Anyone whose voice is to appear on the podcast has given their consent to be recorded. And there are other traditions that we could look at. But during our discussion, we talked about the fact that we have such thing as a group conscience, and something that I did not bring to the group beforehand. Thinking that the previous two recordings would have been that group conscience, there are a whole lot of new people on the meetings since we did those recordings over a year ago. And so I did want to read Tradition 2 and a few paragraphs from the Green Book. And again, this is starting on page 79 in the Green Book. Tradition 2. For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as expressed in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. The second tradition builds on the principle of SAA unity in all aspects of the program. Our wisdom derives from the group, not from any single individual. This tradition also builds on the principle of humility. Our best group decisions are guided by our reliance on a higher power, rather than on natural intelligence, special expertise, personal power, or skill at debate. This ideal of basing our group decisions on spiritual principles rather than personal opinion or power is different from what we may be used to. We discovered that in SAA, no single member has authority over any other SAA member, but that God has ultimate authority over us all. We all have opinions on group issues, but keeping a spiritual focus raises us above the personal level and shows our commitment to finding solutions that fulfill the group's needs rather than our personal desires. We find ourselves asking what is right instead of who is right. As we listen to one another while drawing on our relationship to a loving God for guidance, an understanding of how to solve issues according to spiritual principles begins to arise within the group. We call this group conscience. Sometimes the conscience is so clear that a group will come to a quick, unanimous decision. In other instances, we may call for a vote to decide the issue. Whatever mechanism is used to make decisions, we strive to keep our minds open. Our experience has shown many cases where a so-called minority view came over time to be recognized as the group conscience after all. In the spirit of SAA unity, we strike a balance between supporting the group's decisions as our own while continuing as a group to seek the will of our higher power. And the first paragraph on page 80, and this will be the last paragraph that I read from this. Group conscience is not the same as unanimity, consensus, majority vote, or compromise. Rather than expressing the will of the group, it is the will of our higher power as expressed through the group. There is no one method used by groups to determine group conscience, but it is always wise to test our decisions against the steps and the traditions as we proceed. In some cases, the group conscience may be expressed by one individual. More typically, the group conscience is discovered only after sifting through many different perspectives, and often represents a view no individual member could have come up with on his or her own. Regardless of our personal views or opinions, we each have a responsibility to play our part in discerning and supporting the group conscience. And so, this week on short notice, I asked for a group conscience after we had been having discussions around this. And ultimately, the group decision was quite clear that people were okay with the recording. And as a compromise, I said that we would only record the intro to the first step, Chip's actual first step, and a few comments afterwards, and then shut off the recording. And so that's exactly what we did. With all of that out of the way, I'm finally ready to turn it over to Chip's first step and the introduction done by his sponsor. So here it is. I hope you enjoy it. Over to you, Ralph.
I'm Ralph Sexaholic. Chip, you're about to share your first step with us. We acknowledge and affirm your courage in taking this step. We would like to clarify some things about this experience for each of us. The primary purpose of your formal first step presentation is to aid you in your program of recovery. It need not be done to please the group or to gain status. There is no right or wrong way to present a first step. Any effort you make is legitimate. Here are some suggestions which others have found helpful. We encourage you to be specific about your behaviors and to speak from your heart. This will help you get in touch with the pain and reality of your addiction. Try not to bury yourself in shame or victimhood. Let us hear you, not your addict, speaking. The group has a responsibility to love, care for, and accept you. The members will avoid judging, giving advice, or taking care of you. Some members may become triggered and may leave the room. Please do not take this personally, nor as a reflection of the quality of your share. I will let you know, I'm going to say 20 minutes remain. This will give you time to complete your presentation and allow time for members to share their impressions of your first step. Remember, we are here for you. May God grant you serenity.
Hello, my name is Chip and I'm a sex addict. I used to say I was a porn addict, but as I have been working the first step, I had to face the fact that it was more than just porn that I was addicted to. My journey into addiction began early in my life. As a youngster, I was held to a very high standard by my parents, especially my dad. To me, my father was perfect. He played running back on his college football team. He was an Ivy League educated attorney who finished at the top of his class. He was a naval aviator who flew jets off aircraft carriers. He became a successful corporate lawyer who served as vice president for an S&P 500 company. I, in contrast, was a failure at everything he deemed important. I was a decent athlete, but not at football. My father felt football was the only way to become successful in life. If I was a failure at that, then I was going to be a failure at everything. I wasn't good, but I had to play anyway. My father told me I was the biggest disappointment in his life after one game. I was in fourth grade at the time. I wasn't a straight A student, though I did make good grades. I was good, but not great, much less perfect, and was reminded of it often. My father used to say, "You must have gotten your brains from your mom because you're so stupid." I felt that no matter what I did, I wasn't going to live up to my father's expectation and that I would always be a failure. My sexual life began in my preteens when I was manually aroused by an older boy at the lake. We were exploring our bodies. I was probably 10 or so. I realize now that this is natural and most people do it, but at the time I felt I was demented for feeling pleasure that way. It was just another proof my father was right. I wasn't good. We never repeated this, but I learned about masturbation that night and how good it felt despite my shame. Soon I discovered my dad's collection of adult magazines. I would take one out at a time and look at the pictures. My father's collection began to add to other more explicit magazines, and so my fascination with images of naked women and men grew. I got caught. My parents asked me what I looked at in the magazines, and I said something about reading the articles. They accepted my lie, despite knowing it wasn't true. My first kiss was a disaster. It was the summer of 1975, and I was 14. I snuck out of my house and walked about 2 blocks to the girls' home. This was in the mid-'70s, and people allowed their daughters to have rooms on the ground floor in front of the house back then. I knocked on her window and we started talking. I asked her if I could kiss her, and she said, okay. I hoisted myself up on the window and leaned in. As we started to kiss, a flashlight beamed on me and someone shouted, "Come out with your hands up." The police had seen a body they thought was breaking into the house and had their guns pulled as I emerged from behind the bushes. They woke up the girls' parents to ask if they knew me, and then took me home in their squad car to wake up my parents and tell them what happened after I snuck out. It was humiliating. Everyone in the city, or at least in our circle of friends and parents, heard about it. 2 months later, I was taken to visit boarding schools. My parents asked which I liked better between the two. I said I liked one, but I didn't want to go now. My parents said they liked the other. 2 weeks later, I watched my parents pull away after dropping me off in a room at the school that they liked, but I didn't. I didn't even have time to tell my friends goodbye. It was very traumatic for a 14-year-old who'd already felt unworthy and unwanted. I hadn't gotten to school in time to try out for the football team, but I tried out for the tennis team, and I was one of the last ones cut. I tried swimming, but dropped it after a few months. Just more failures for a born loser. Feeling alone, I masturbated frequently to anything that I could find to arouse me. I dated a girl for a while, but it didn't last. Not lasting long with girlfriends become a common trait of mine. In 10th grade, I had sex with a girl for the first time. Being a boarding student, I didn't have a car, so we were in her father's car. The next day, I was called into the principal's office at school. The girl's father realized what happened in the backseat of his car, confronted his daughter who confessed, and he called the school to complain about my actions. Once again, my parents were informed of my indiscretion. I never got to date that girl again and was confined to campus for the rest of the school year. It was around a month or so, but I don't remember exactly. Going home in the summer wasn't helpful as I was no longer in my old school clique. I had basically disappeared and wasn't invited to parties or events. It was like I just vanished off the planet. I'd work my summer job and then spend most nights at home by myself. I even looked forward to going to school. My home was no longer a safe place for me. I felt my parents and friends had all abandoned me. To this day, I still get introduced to people who know my sisters or my parents, but have never heard of me. I didn't date anyone for long the last 2 years of high school, despite having girls interested in me. I had sex a few times, but never followed up with the girls afterwards. I got a reputation for not being a nice guy, which was how I saw myself. I once had a girl who liked me come to visit me in the infirmary when I had a cold. I had her orally pleasure me while we were alone in the room. The nurse came in and caught us. The girl was mortified, but I didn't care. I just figured she expected me to be that way. I was a bad boy after all. For senior prom, I took a girl who I barely knew. She had told a mutual friend she wanted to go out with me, so I asked her. After the dance, I slept with her and then never spoke to her again. I graduated 2 weeks later and left that city for good. To this day, I don't even remember her name. All I remember is her blonde hair and the dress she wore. I'm ashamed of that because she was really a nice girl. She deserved to be treated better. After 12 years of boys-only education, the last 4 in a totally isolated environment for the most part, I was assigned to a co-ed dorm in college. I thought I was in heaven. No one thought of me as a bad boy, and I could restart my life. I met a nice girl right away, and we got along great for a while. But then I pushed her to have sex one night, and so she ended it. Suddenly, I was the bad boy again. I remember I slept with different girls in the fall without having a serious relationship with any of them. Most of the girls I slept with only did it with me one time. I just couldn't respect anyone who wanted to be with a loser like me. If a girl treated me nicely, I would take advantage of it. If she ignored me, I figured I deserved it because I wasn't worth it. In the spring, I met a girl who I would spend the majority of my time with in Dallas. We had a great sex life, and she taught me a lot. But our dating life was a revolving door of meeting at parties, getting closer, having sex, moving in together, getting tired of each other, breaking up, and swearing we'd never do it again. A few weeks or months later, we'd see each other at a party, and the cycle started again. This went on for 5 years. Our breakups involved us each doing some painful things to each other. Cheating with other people, even close friends, was usually how it would end. Then a while later, we'd see each other and start all over again. When I wasn't with my main girl, I would sleep with whoever would let me. I didn't have a serious relationship with anyone. I never had the type of relationships my friends did. They dated girls for a long time. I seemed to have a different one every week. I was always the guy my friends tried to set up, but the nice girls wouldn't like. I assumed they could see I was a loser. If the girls didn't drop me right away, I treated her badly, so she'd drop me soon anyway. I had a job in college waiting tables, and after college, I started tending bar. I was pretty good at it. Eventually, I became a head bartender, then a training bartender as the restaurant was building new locations all over. I went to several cities to teach new teams how to run the bar and on the owner's dime. I never had a problem finding partners in the cities I visited. I felt it was a pretty good life. I could hook up with waitresses or customers everywhere I went with no attachment. After one particularly ugly breakup with my college girlfriend, I decided to move to the next city when they opened a restaurant. 2 of my best friends from college lived near there at the times. I never saw or spoke to the college girl again after that. Before I left, I got a girl pregnant. I didn't know I got someone pregnant. I was never told. The baby was born in October, and I had left the city earlier in May. The girl had to know she was pregnant before I left, but one night stands were nothing new to me. To this day, I have no idea who the mother is. Taking over as head bartender of one of the more popular restaurants in the major city was both a good and bad thing. I was making a ton of cash, and I did a good job of convincing late-night guests at the bar to come see my apartment. It fed my ego to take advantage of women and yet taught me nothing about being in a relationship. I quit the bartending job a while later and became manager of a restaurant. I started getting into porn at this time as my employees were off limits, and I didn't have the late-night bar pickups available since the restaurant wasn't a late-night bar style of restaurant. I reverted to masturbation to make up for my lack of social skills with the opposite sex. That's when I discovered adult bookshops and cinemas. There was no internet to speak of then, so you had to rent videos at these stores. The one I frequented the most had an arcade where you could go back and watch videos playing in a private booth. It was weird at first, but less uncomfortable than renting X-rated videos with some family waiting behind you to rent their movies. I worked at the job nonstop for 3 years, saved up a month's vacation time, and was planning on going to Australia to explore the outback when my grandfather had a heart attack. My family asked me to come home to take care of him for a few weeks instead, so I canceled my trip 3 days before I was to leave and returned to my hometown. One night, my family told me to go to a party a friend was hosting. They thought I needed to get out and meet someone. That night, I was introduced to the woman who would become my first wife. A few days later, my grandfather asked me if I was happy in the restaurant business. I said, not really. So he said he'd pay for me to get my master's degree in business if I wanted to do that. I called and resigned that day. 12 months later, I was engaged, and a few months after that, I started my new career in finance. It seemed I was on the right track finally. Things went well for the first years with my wife. We had 2 children. I was promoted to a sales manager of a branch in a different city. But after the second child was born, things started to change. My wife was told about fibromyalgia, and a few days later, she decided she had it. A year later, she said she had chronic fatigue syndrome, then a rare reaction to Epstein-Barr virus. 2 or 3 other rare illnesses followed before settling on Lyme disease, despite not having any of the symptoms of the disease. She once said she had the rare type of that disease. When I asked her doctor, he told me there was nothing and never had been anything wrong with her. We had returned to our hometown by this time. I moved out of our bedroom and into the guest room soon afterwards. I lived in that room for the next 5 years. Porn became my sex partner instead of my wife. I looked at porn nearly every night. It started off with straight men and women sex, but I eventually fell down the rabbit hole into videos more and more on the edge. I was becoming desensitized to what I was seeing, although I didn't realize it. I just thought I was searching for more and more erotic scenes. I finally divorced my first wife after 15 years of marriage and started dating my current wife. When I had the kids over, my soon-to-be wife couldn't stay, so I'd masturbate to porn on those nights and sleep with her when the kids were gone. I tried to stop once we got married. I eventually started looking just late at night when my wife went to sleep. Sometimes I'd masturbate, but usually I just looked. It started becoming more and more a habit. I got caught by my wife. I said I'd stop, but after a while I started again. I got caught again. I told my wife I would never look at porn in our bed again. That's when I went down a deeper hole. I started acting out in other parts of the house. I got caught again and I swore off porn in the house. And then I started going to adult cinemas. I was usually too tired or too stressed to have sex with my wife, but I would find time to sneak off to the cinemas. I was approached by men at the cinemas. This was a new twist for me as that didn't happen back in D.C. I just wanted to watch my porn and masturbate. I knew sometimes people would watch anyways, despite me saying no. I eventually got accustomed to that as well. It was a way for me to validate myself. If someone wants to look, then I must not be as gross and disgusting as I felt. In February, I got an email from a family heritage DNA site from a woman claiming to be my daughter. We had both done their DNA test, but years apart. This was a tremendous shock as I never knew I'd impregnated anyone except for my first wife. I finally decided, after a lot of prodding from my second wife, to do another blood test. Much to my surprise, it confirmed the first result. I was the father of a 34-year-old woman. I was ashamed and extremely guilty, which drove me to the adult cinemas even more. The classic addiction cycle. Feel shame for acting out and acting out to relieve the shame. I even began listening to porn while driving my car. I was falling fast into insanity. I was risking my life and others to get my fix. Around June of this year, my wife confronted me about going to the cinemas. She had been tracking me on my phone. I was busted. I argued that masturbation was normal, men were visual animals, anything I could think of except the horrible truth. Despite knowing I was being tracked, I kept going. I couldn't stop. I was left with nothing but the fact that I had become addicted to porn. She said I had to get treated for my addiction or she was going to leave me. I said I would get help. I knew I had a problem. A few days later, I was back in denial. I said I'd go to a clinic, but I really didn't think I had an addiction, that I could stop any time. I could see the pain in her eyes. I knew what I said had hurt her. I promised to go with an open mind, although I was confident it wasn't a problem. I didn't realize at that time how common my defenses were. It's what every addict does to avoid looking at themselves with open eyes. I truly believe the clinic saved my life and my marriage. The clinic had me do a trauma egg assignment. In the middle of it, I just broke down. I had to face the hurt my parents had caused me growing up, never being good enough, being told I was the biggest embarrassment in my father's life, the boarding school experience, etc. Plus, I had to face the way I treated women, porn and sex, not to mention the pain I'd caused my wife. I'm struggling to find peace with myself. I'm trying to learn to love myself, although I have a long way to go with that. It took me a long time, but I now see how my porn and sex addiction was controlling my life and affecting my view of myself as a person. I'd lost control of myself, and I hated myself for not having that control. I always tried to hold myself to a high standard, yet at the same time I was allowing myself to be controlled by my most base emotions. I have not acted out for 49 days. I'm determined to stay sober from this point forward. I'm a sex addict. I will always be a sex addict. I lost control of myself due to my addiction, and I'm working the steps to come to grips with, not cure my addiction. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Chip. So, Matthew, I'm not sure if we have a script. I will say we will open up some feedback shares on Chip's first step. I'm Jason. I'm a sex addict. Grateful for this. We will move to David, and Jeremy.
Thank you, Jason. Chip, you are our brother. And what a beautiful, honest, and raw story with such rigorous honesty. I'm so grateful that I've gotten to know you. So much of our story is very similar in terms of our acting out behaviors, the spiral, the madness, the pain, especially of those childhood images. I choked up as you shared that story of your childhood. I know how much that scarred me. I can only imagine with direct messages like that from your father, how that scarred you and made you feel unloved. Well, I can assure you, in this room, you are loved. You are our brother. And thank you for sharing your first step with us. I'm David, and I'm an addict.
Thanks, David. We'll move on to the next David.
Hi, I'm David, sex and porn addict. Chip, just amazing. It's funny how similar some of our stories are, despite the fact that, and not to call you out on this, you're a lot older than I am. But it just goes to show how it doesn't matter, who you are or how old you are, the addict in us is it's the same, different faces, different places, but it's for the most part the same story. It's amazing. I'm glad I was able to be a part of this first step and get to hear you share everything. And I just appreciate, being able to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, David. Next we have Jeremy.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy and I belong here. Chip, buddy, that was an incredible first step. And I'm just so proud of you for taking that. And I had tears in my eyes at various points listening to you. We share the same disease, but we have different symptoms, and parts of our story are wildly different, but some of them are very, very similar. I totally relate with your relapsing, you being caught with pornography, by your wife, and then you say you'll never do it again, and then it's unmanageable, and you go back to it, and you get caught again, and you go back and get caught again. I'm with you. I feel for you so much with that difficult relationship with your parents, which I also have. So I feel you. My heart breaks for you. But the word that kept coming up in your share was loser. And I want to tell you right now, you are not a loser. You are the furthest thing from a loser that there is. You are brave. You are strong, you are valuable, and you are loved. And I thank you so much for sharing your first step with us here today. And I'll go ahead and pass. I'm Jeremy, and I belong here.
Thanks, Jeremy. I want to thank everyone for allowing us to record this first step in this meeting. Much gratitude to the group. I'm going to turn off the recorder now and hand it back over to Matthew. Thanks. Again, many thanks to our group for allowing us to do this recording. Many thanks to Chip for being courageous enough to share his first step here on the podcast and asking me if it was okay. I'm always grateful to share people's personal stories here on the podcast. I am so grateful that despite how things arose, that they all worked out really beautifully. And I'm grateful that we have a group that can voice when they feel something isn't right and bring it to the group and let the group decide. So much love for everyone in my group, no matter where we fall on certain issues. But I'm so grateful that it worked out and that we were able to do this. At the end of this episode, I wanted to read a few reviews that we've gotten on Apple Music or iTunes, and I'll be rounding out the episode talking about some music that is very, very spiritual to me. I talked about it in several other episodes that I am going to be seeing Heilung's ritual in San Francisco in September, and that is coming up this weekend, and I'm super excited about that and wanted to talk about some of their music that has just come out. And the week following, there's one particular piece that I've been wanting to talk about for quite a while that closes their ritual, and I want to share my spiritual experience with that, seeing that live. But yeah, on to some of the reviews. When I was looking up old episodes to listen to, I checked out the ratings and realized that we had two that I don't think I've read on the podcast. The one from May, I'm not sure if I've read this or not, but I will read it again. Anyway, it says, "Found this podcast by chance and haven't stopped listening for a week straight now. Thanks for the message, because I've been looking for a group, and they're hard to come by in person in the Midwest and South. Very eye-opening, and grateful for that review." The next one I know I haven't read on the podcast, and this came to us a few weeks ago from Rob SAA. "It's so helpful to have this podcast aid in daily recovery. I meet once per week with our local recovery group, and as hard as I work throughout the week, in between meetings there are times throughout the week that can be challenging to maintain sobriety. But learning new tools of recovery to help with addiction is important to maintain sobriety one day at a time, and this podcast has been a huge help for that. To me, it's almost like having a meeting at any point throughout the day whenever I feel I need it, even though our group actually meets just once a week. Thank you so much for offering this, and you're very welcome." I'm so grateful that people are able to utilize this as a new program tool. I know podcasts have been really helpful for me in my life, and some of the recovery podcasts that I've been listening to over the years have been immensely helpful, but none of them were really focused on sex addiction. And so I really wanted to put out something like this and brought it to our Bay Area intergroup. And they thought about using this as a new tool for reaching the public. I was super, super grateful and not quite sure how it would turn out. And I'm surprised all the time to hear how many people are being helped by the podcast, either finding the rooms of SAA or finding this as a meeting in between meetings. It's just such a gift, and I'm really glad that it's helping a lot of people. And those are the reviews that we've gotten recently. I'm not sure if we've gotten any YouTube comments, and if so, I will read those on another episode. No new feedback emails. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to talking about the music of Heilung. I have been talking about them since, I think, episode 25, which was sometime in the summer of 2021 when I really discovered the healing power of their music. Again, the name Heilung means healing in German. And I had been aware of them for quite a while, but really started listening to them in the summer of 2021. And now I get the chance to see a live ritual, and so grateful for that. Their new album came out about a month ago, and on one of the episodes, I had mentioned a song called Tenet that had just been released the midnight before I was doing the recording. And that song is a 13-minute palindrome. And instead of me trying to summarize what this is, I thought I would read straight out of what Heilung themselves have written about this. Tenet is a palindrome in every respect. All individual musical parts, melodies, and instruments, even at times the lyrics, play the same both forward and backwards. The song is based on the so-called Sator square, the earliest datable two-dimensional palindrome, first found in Herculaneum, Italy, a city buried under the ashes of the erupting Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, at the time of the flourishing Roman Empire. What is particularly interesting with this palindrome is that not only does it read forwards and backwards, but also vertically in both directions. And so this is five-letter words that are arranged in a square: Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas.
Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas.
And I did play a hidden Easter egg clip at the end of episode 62. And so I did want to play a couple of different clips from this, like other meditative music for me, a mantra that keeps repeating over and over: Sator, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. And it becomes more and more intense throughout the song. The melody at the beginning here, using the software that I use for the podcast, I can take sound and do a reverse. So I've done that with this song, and I wanted to play a little bit forwards. And the reverse. And it's just so cool how it's the same melody either way. There are some hidden Easter egg messages in it that they recorded forwards, but flipped it for the final mix. So at the beginning, you have the children's voices, and you can hear one of them sounds reversed. And so I'll play a little bit of that, and there's some laughter that happens after that. Listening to the original track, I couldn't figure out what it was, but listening to it in reverse, it's the sound of Kai laughing. And there are some other things that he said that I'm not going to put here on this episode. But yeah, with all the intensity of the song, the building of the 5 words as a mantra just becomes so meditative for me and incredibly powerful. Just after that part is over, there's lovely section of Maria doing some vocalizations. But the ending of this song really, really surprised me. It's the first time that I've heard them sing in Latin. And the way all their voices come together is so magical, and I absolutely love this. From what I've found, the translation is, "The unconquered sun brings friendship to those who bring peace, having a sweet safety, and peace stands by the work of fortune." I've seen a few other translations here and there, but I can't find them. Anyway, there are so many different cool things about this song that I am just like absolutely geeking out on history, learning about the Sator Square and where it's been found around Europe, and the various parts that are in Latin. Anyway, love every minute of the song. And I also love it in reverse. And again, this is the way that my higher power connects to me through music, and this spiritual journey that I've been on over the past year with this music has just been incredible. So I'm really, really grateful for that. Anyway, that's all I have for this week. And like I mentioned, we didn't get any new feedback emails. And so if you want to send some feedback for the podcast that can be read here on an episode, you can reach us at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. And if you want to reach me personally to be a guest on a future episode, be part of a panel, or have any questions about the podcast, you can reach me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. Well, that will be it for this week. I'm so grateful for Chip, for my group, and for everyone that's tuned into this episode. And as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.